Well, thank you very much, AJ. Thank you very much, Rosemary. It's a real thrill for me to be here. And I have to say, as the Member of Parliament for Toronto Centre and a UTS mother as of September, I was much more anxious about the UTS admission results than I was about my own by-election. So it's wonderful to be here and to be joining this terrific community. When AJ and Rosemary asked me, invited me to be part of this, they initially suggested that I talk about my book, Plutocrats, but I've already given a TED talk about that, and I didn't want to give you guys reheated material. So what I'm going to do is rehearse for you an op-ed that I'm writing for the New York Times that should be published in the next couple of weeks. I'm going to tell you my email address, and if you have any feedback, not on the delivery because it will appear in print, but on the content, send it to me and so I can crowdsource the editing a little bit, okay? So my email is Chrystia, my first name, .Freeland, my last name, @gmail.com. And then if you end up reading this in the paper or online, you'll know you heard it first. Okay, so globalization on the cheap. We can't have globalization on the cheap. That's the most important lesson from the Kremlin's annexation of Crimea and the ongoing effort Russia is making to undermine what is left of Ukraine's sovereignty and statehood. To be sure, this is first and foremost a tragedy for Ukraine and Ukrainians. More than 100 have died already, and it's quite reasonable to fear that hundreds, if not thousands more, will die in the coming months. The conflict's other principal and immediate victims are Russians themselves, whose already faint hopes that Vladimir Putin might turn from the butcher of Chechnya to the modernizer and eventual democratizer of his country have now been definitively squashed. But the fight in Ukraine is also a wider warning for us all that the casual, low-cost approach we have all taken to building a post-Soviet world order just won't work. We thought we could have globalization, chiefly of goods and capital, but also of people and ideas, on the cheap. Putin has taught us otherwise. Our belief that we could invent a new world order as seamlessly as shopping on Amazon and as cheaply as buying at Walmart was lazy, but it was also understandable. After 4 decades of a costly superpower standoff, whose parameters largely defined the post-World War II era, the Soviet Union collapsed not with a bang, but with a whimper. 1989 and 1991, when the Berlin Wall collapsed, and then when the Soviet Union did, were no Putin-style power grabs. They were the unilateral surrender of a political and economic system whose people, including the elites, had decided just didn't work. The rejection of communism as an economic and political system in the Soviet Union and its former empire was a historical watershed. The consequences beyond Moscow's immediate sphere of influence were even more significant. With central planning discredited, most of the rest of the world began to move towards a market economy and, albeit more haltingly in many countries, democracy. This wasn't just an age of Metternich-style geopolitical realignment. It was the decision of more than 2 billion people to join the G7 political economy. History had ended, and the world was flat. The immediate and obvious economic return was the peace dividend, all the money we no longer had to spend defending ourselves against the communist threat. The wider economic consequences were even more significant. Stock markets and corporate profits boomed. The global economy grew too, although, as we are starting to notice now, not much of this prosperity was shared with a hollowed-out Western middle class. But for the world's economic elites, both in the East and in the West, it was all good. The global consumer market was hugely expanded, as was the global supply of labor. The result was the opportunity to amass fortunes at a speed and a scale unseen since the Gilded Age. The global plutocracy was born. But of course, history hadn't really ended, and the world wasn't really flat. Capital, labor, and consumers may have gone global, but politics was still national. We built a global economy whose participants were governed by very different domestic playbooks and without establishing new international rules of the game. The contrast with the last time the West built a new international political and economic order is striking. After the Second World War, we spent a great deal of time, money, and political effort rebuilding the economies and political systems of the vanquished Axis powers and establishing a modus vivendi with our communist opponents. We called the years that followed the Cold War, but the most striking part of that moniker and the huge achievement is that it was cold, not hot. This time around, we decided we could build globalization on the cheap, and that the consumerist allure of our economic system and the moral appeal of our political one could substitute for the hard work of building a new operating system for the world. Putin and the people of Ukraine's Maidan have shown us that won't work. Putin showed that the autocrats of this new world order, all of whom, by the way, are also members of the global plutocracy, won't necessarily play by our rules of international relations just because we think that they should. Putin is happy to sell Russia's natural resources in the global market, and he and his elite prefer to educate their children, safeguard their fortunes, and spend their holidays in the West. But it turns out that those checkbook and lifestyle choices do not mean that he has signed up to liberal capitalist democracy in any wider sense. He is imposing an increasingly repressive, xenophobic, and homophobic regime at home. Now he is testing how far he can extend his rule beyond Russia's borders with impunity. And the answer seems to be quite far indeed. The paradox of Putin's challenge to the end of history era is that he is able to challenge our sketchily defined New World Order only thanks to its economic success. Russia's elites are richer and more self-confident than were their Soviet predecessors, precisely because globalization and the capitalist democracies who are its engines works. Putin realized early on that our version of post-Soviet globalization was an a la carte menu from which he need only order his favorite dishes. He could imprison Mikhail Khodorkovsky and expropriate Yukos, close down Russia's independent media and imprison his political rivals, and kill and repress ethnic minorities and homosexuals, and still be an honored member of the G8 and the feted host of the Winter Olympics. We were, he understood, perfectly happy to allow him to be part of the end of history light. That's a scenario which has a great deal of appeal for his fellow BRIC leaders, regardless of where they find themselves on the democracy curve. And that is why Putin's aggression towards Ukraine, his most brazen assertion yet that participation in the world economy comes with no strings attached, has found support, or at least met with only tepid opposition, in so many emerging markets. If it were only a question of what the West would tolerate, Putin and the 21st century's other autocrats would probably, I'm sad to say, have pretty free rein outside the borders of NATO and the EU, which seem to be the only places in the world where history really has ended. But Putin's problem is that the collapse of the Soviet Union didn't end only what was left of the world's belief in central planning. It also gave everyone in the world the hope that they could be free. Putin and his fellow autocrats would be delighted to live in a world of global capitalism in which democracy at home is optional. But the people of Ukraine disagreed. The great danger for Putin is that, inspired by their Slavic neighbors' example, the people of Russia might decide that they disagree too. And that, ultimately, is why globalization on the cheap is not sustainable. It has empowered both dictators and the people who seek to topple them. And it hasn't given any of us a roadmap for what to do when these forces inevitably collide. The so-called realists, who really are advocates of today's globalization light world, see only half of the forces that have been unleashed by the end of the Cold War world. Even if we wanted to accommodate the autocrats the global economy has enriched, it isn't realistic to imagine that we unilaterally can choose to do so. The people of Kyiv's Maidan, like the people of the Arab Spring, have shown us that they aren't willing to live in authoritarian regimes for the sake of the international stability that repression provides. The consequence is that we are going to have to devote more political energy and more money to making the flat world work than we had expected. Between 1980 and 1991, the world was transformed as profoundly as it had been by the Second World War. The greatest generation, my grandparents, your great-grandparents, understood that a new world needed new rules and new institutions, and that building them would be almost as hard as overturning the old order had been. We put that work off 2 decades ago. In countries like Ukraine and Venezuela and Thailand and Syria, we are now reaping the consequences. Thank you very much.